Picture this: Hollywood's most celebrated leading man, the king of Hollywood himself, walking red carpets with a $1 million smile while harboring secrets so explosive they could have destroyed everything he built. For 3 decades, Clark Gable lived a double life so carefully constructed that even those closest to him never saw the complete picture. But now, after all these years, the truth has finally emerged from the shadows of old Hollywood, and what we've discovered will change everything you thought you knew about the man who made women swoon and men envious. This isn't just another celebrity exposé. This is the untold story of how America's most famous actor became one of its most successful deceivers. The year is 1901, and in a modest clapboard duplex in Cadiz, Ohio, a child is born who will grow up to become Hollywood royalty. But even his birth certificate tells a lie. Clark Gable's entry into this world was marked by tragedy and confusion. His mother, Adeline, defied doctors' warnings that pregnancy would kill her. She was right to be concerned. Suffering from what physicians believed was a progressive brain tumor, Addie gave birth to her son at an expensive cost of $10 for a house call, with volunteer help from a neighbor. Her behavior had become increasingly erratic, her health deteriorating by the day. She had only 10 months with her baby boy before death claimed her at just 31 years old. And here's where the first secret begins: that birth certificate listed the newborn as female. Whether this was a clerical error or something more symbolic, it set the stage for a lifetime of manufactured identity. After his mother's death, young Clark was shipped off to relatives while his father searched for a new wife and a fresh start. When William Gable remarried in 1903, the boy finally returned to a family home, but something had been lost in those formative years. Psychologists who later analyzed Gable's life suggested he spent his entire adulthood searching for a substitute mother, a pattern that would define his most controversial relationships. At 13, he was the youngest member of his town's band, showing an artistic side that contrasted sharply with his father's blue-collar expectations. By 16, he had dropped out of school and was working in a tire factory, fixing cars, and engaging in mechanical work. But inside, a different Clark Gable was forming, one who recited Shakespeare to friends and devoured literature when no one was watching. Everything changed when the teenage factory worker attended a production of The Bird of Paradise. Something ignited in him that night, a realization so powerful it would alter the course of his life. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he was meant to be an actor. But the path from factory worker to movie star wasn't going to be easy, especially for a young man with bad teeth, an unflattering hairstyle, and a voice that observers described as girly and effeminate. Enter the first woman who would transform Clark Gable into someone else entirely. Josephine Dillon was 18 years his senior when they met in Oregon, where she worked as a theater manager. She saw potential in the lanky 23-year-old, but more importantly, she saw a project. In what can only be described as a real-life My Fair Lady scenario, Dillon used her own money to recreate Gable from the ground up. She paid to fix his terrible teeth, styled his hair, trained him to lower his speaking voice to that distinctive masculine register that would later become his trademark, and taught him body language that conveyed confidence and masculinity. She invested everything she had in transforming this rough-edged boy into a polished performer. And when she thought he was ready, they married, and she took him to Hollywood to launch his career. But here's the thing about creating a Frankenstein's monster of charm and good looks: sometimes it turns on its creator. Gable used Dillon's connections, her training, and her money to get his foot in the door. And then he left her for someone wealthier. Rhea Langham was everything Dillon wasn't: incredibly wealthy, connected to New York high society, and able to open doors that Dillon never could. Gable divorced his first wife and married Langham in 1931, using her elite connections to establish himself on Broadway. The pattern was becoming clear. Gable was willing to use women as stepping stones to success, attaching himself to those who could advance his career and discarding them when someone better came along. But the studio executives at MGM initially weren't impressed with what they saw. Louis B. Mayer, the studio's notoriously harsh head, told Gable he was too elephant-eared and unattractive to be a leading man. Can you imagine telling the future king of Hollywood that he wasn't good-looking enough? But MGM's female audiences saw something the executives didn't. When Gable was cast in minor roles as thugs and villains in the early 1930s, women responded with enthusiastic fan mail. The studio realized they were sitting on a goldmine, they just needed to refine the product. What happened next was a complete makeover. MGM groomed Gable's eyebrows, styled his hair, gave him dentures to replace his terrible teeth, and forced him into rigorous gym routines. They created a persona, the lumberjack in evening clothes, a combination of savage masculinity and civilized sophistication. As biographer E.J. Fleming explained, Gable was a complete studio creation. What audiences saw on camera was the antithesis of who he truly was. The real Clark Gable was being buried under layers of manufactured charm, designer suits, and carefully crafted publicity. And then came the women. So many women. Joan Crawford, one of Hollywood's reigning queens, described their first meeting in electric terms. It was like an electric current went through my body. My knees buckled. If he hadn't held me by the shoulders, I'd have dropped. Their affair blazed through 8 films and 3 decades, continuing through multiple marriages, neither of them to each other. They were so obvious about their passion that MGM executives demanded they stop seeing each other, threatening to activate the morality clauses in both their contracts. This was largely a bluff, since MGM would never sacrifice 2 of their biggest stars, but it shows how brazen their affair had become. The fan magazines were starting to hint at what everyone in Hollywood knew: Gable and Crawford were consumed with each other. But Crawford was just one of many. Gable slept with nearly every female co-star he worked with. Jean Harlow, Norma Shearer, Greta Garbo, the list goes on and on. He was still married to Rhea Langham during most of these affairs, but that didn't slow him down. He had become Hollywood's most notorious womanizer, and MGM's publicity machine worked overtime to keep his reputation from completely crumbling. They sold him as a charming rogue, a lovable scoundrel whose affairs were just part of his masculine appeal. American audiences in the 1930s were captivated by this new type of leading man, someone less European and refined than Cary Grant or Fred Astaire, more American and rugged. During the Great Depression, when the nation's masculinity felt threatened by economic collapse, Gable represented potent, white, burly American manhood. He was exactly what the country needed to see on screen. In 1934, Gable starred in It Happened One Night, a romantic comedy that would win him his first Academy Award and cement his status as Hollywood royalty. The film was revolutionary in its portrayal of masculinity. In one famous scene, Gable's character removes his shirt to reveal his not wearing an undershirt underneath. This wasn't a costume choice made by wardrobe, it was simply how Gable lived. "I didn't wear undershirts since I was a teen," he explained years later. "They made me feel hemmed in and smothered." This one personal preference allegedly caused men's undershirt sales to plummet across America as millions of male moviegoers decided to emulate their idol. Whether this story is entirely true or partly Hollywood legend, it demonstrates the incredible influence Gable wielded over American culture. But behind all the success and adoration lurked darker secrets. In 1933, shortly after Gable had his teeth extracted due to severe periodontitis and was fitted for dentures, rumors began circulating about a hit-and-run accident. The story went that Gable, drunk behind the wheel, struck and killed a pedestrian. According to the whispers, MGM's notorious fixers went into overdrive, working with the district attorney's office to cover up the incident. The studio allegedly blamed a mid-level executive, claiming he was driving while Gable was merely a passenger. This executive was promised lifetime employment and financial security in exchange for taking the fall. While this story has never been definitively proven, it fits perfectly with how MGM operated during the Golden Age. Studios had entire departments dedicated to covering up scandals, bribing police, paying off victims, and controlling the press. If this hit-and-run did occur, MGM had both the means and the motive to make it disappear. Then came 1935 and the scandal that MGM's fixers worked hardest to conceal. Gable was cast opposite Loretta Young in Call of the Wild, a film shot on location in the wilderness. Young was a devout Catholic who carried a swear jar on set, demanding a quarter every time someone cursed, with the money going to the nuns. When Spencer Tracy heard about this, he allegedly threw down a $20 bill and said, "Here's a 20, sister. Go fuck yourself." Young played the role of Hollywood's virtuous innocent, the good Catholic girl who didn't engage in the industry's debauchery. But that carefully constructed image was about to be shattered. Gable and Young began flirting almost immediately on set. Despite their apparent incompatibility, Young as the religious virgin and Gable as the notorious womanizer, the attraction was undeniable. What happened next depends on whose version you believe. According to Young's own account, revealed only in her posthumously published memoir, Gable entered her private train compartment on the journey back to Hollywood after filming Wrapped. There, she claimed, he raped her. The encounter resulted in a pregnancy that Young, as a devout Catholic, refused to terminate. What followed was perhaps the greatest cover-up in Hollywood history. Young hid her pregnancy as long as possible, then fled to England claiming to be on vacation. When people questioned her absence, she said she was dealing with a condition from childhood. She somehow smuggled herself back to her mother's house in Venice, California, where she gave birth in secret, likely with the help of nuns and strict confidentiality. She sent the baby girl to an orphanage and returned to work, having trimmed down her figure. 19 months later, Young announced to powerful gossip columnist Luella Parsons that she planned to adopt 2 babies as a single mother. She then collected her daughter from the orphanage and told the press, "Oops. The second baby got reclaimed. I'm just adopting this one baby who looks so much like me." The child, Judy Lewis, grew up not knowing who her real parents were. But as she got older, her distinctive features, especially her prominent ears, betrayed the truth. She had Clark Gable's unmistakable ears. Classmates and cruel kids on the playground figured it out before Judy did. "Your father is Clark Gable," they'd taunt. But Young refused to confirm the truth, maintaining the adoption story even as Judy begged for honesty. It wasn't until Judy was 31 years old that she finally learned with certainty that Clark Gable was her biological father. By then, Gable had been dead for years. He never publicly acknowledged her, never provided financial support beyond what MGM secretly arranged, and never had a relationship with his daughter. This wasn't just a secret. It was a complete erasure of a child's identity, maintained by 2 of Hollywood's biggest stars, enabled by the most powerful studio in the business, and accepted by a press corps that valued access over truth. Judy Lewis grew up knowing she was different, feeling the weight of a secret she didn't understand, and bearing physical features that told a story everyone could see but no one would speak aloud. The psychological damage of such a deception is incalculable. And it was all to protect Clark Gable's image and Loretta Young's Catholic good girl reputation. Meanwhile, Gable's personal life continued its pattern of marriages and affairs. He divorced Rhea Langham and, in 1939, married the love of his life, comedienne Carole Lombard. She was witty, beautiful, successful, and apparently the only woman who truly captured Gable's heart. They seemed genuinely happy together, a Hollywood power couple who actually worked. That same year, Gable starred as Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind, a role that would define his career and make him immortal in cinema history. The film became the most successful movie of all time adjusted for inflation, and Gable's performance as the charming scoundrel who tells Scarlett O'Hara, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn," became one of the most iconic moments in film history. For a brief moment, it seemed like Gable had everything: professional success, public adoration, and true love. But happiness in Hollywood never lasts long. In January 1942, Carole Lombard was sent to Indianapolis by the Treasury Department to help sell war bonds. After a successful campaign, she decided to fly home to California despite the department's preference for train travel. On January 16, 1942, her plane crashed into a mountain near Las Vegas, killing everyone on board. Lombard was only 33 years old. Gable was utterly devastated. According to friends, he went on a massive drinking binge, consumed by grief and guilt. Some say he blamed himself for not being with her, for not insisting she take the train. In August 1942, a broken man enlisted in the Army Air Force. But this wasn't a typical celebrity stint designed for publicity photos. Gable told his former publicist's widow, "I'm going in, and I don't expect to come back." He flew actual combat missions over Germany, putting himself in genuine danger. Historians have speculated ever since whether Gable had a death wish, whether he wanted to die in combat to join Carole. But there was another danger lurking. Adolf Hitler was obsessed with American cinema and considered Clark Gable his favorite American actor. The German dictator had allegedly obtained a bootlegged copy of Gone with the Wind before its UK release and watched it repeatedly. Hitler considered Gable one of the most prized war criminals in the Allied forces and offered generous rewards to any German soldier who could capture him alive. Gable was acutely aware of this threat. He once told a friend, "If Hitler catches me, the son of a bitch will put me in a cage like a gorilla and send me on a tour of Germany." He added that if his plane was ever hit by German forces, he wouldn't even try to survive. Think about the psychological state Gable must have been in, grief-stricken over losing his wife, possibly suicidal, flying combat missions while knowing the enemy leader wanted to capture and humiliate him. Yet he continued flying, continued risking his life, continued hoping perhaps that a German bullet would end his pain. He survived the war and returned to Hollywood, but something fundamental had changed. The magic was gone. His type of rough, unapologetic masculinity no longer fit the post-war era quite as perfectly. New stars were rising: John Wayne, Burt Lancaster, Rock Hudson, James Dean, actors who represented different versions of American manhood. Gable continued making films throughout the 1950s, but his star had dimmed. He married 2 more times, wives number 4 and 5, relationships that never captured the magic he'd had with Lombard. He drank heavily, struggled with his weight, smoked constantly, and showed signs of declining health. His co-stars noticed the change. When he worked with Marilyn Monroe on The Misfits in 1960, The production was a disaster. Monroe was going through her own breakdown, showing up late or not at all, dealing with addiction and psychological problems. The film screenwriter was Arthur Miller, Monroe's soon-to-be ex-husband, adding tension to the set. Gable, 59 and struggling with his own demons, insisted on doing his own stunts, including physically demanding rope-tying scenes in the harsh Nevada desert. 2 days after filming Wrapped, Clark Gable suffered a massive heart attack. He was rushed to Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital, where doctors initially believed he would recover. "He's doing fine," they told the press. But on November 16, 1960, 10 days after his admission, Gable died suddenly of coronary thrombosis. He was 59 years old. Marilyn Monroe, already fragile, was devastated. She blamed herself for the delays and difficulties on set, convinced that the stress she'd caused had contributed to Gable's fatal heart attack. The guilt haunted her until her own death less than 2 years later. Gable's widow, Kay, was pregnant when he died. She gave birth to their son, John Clark Gable, 4 months after his father's death. In a gesture of remarkable grace, Kay invited Marilyn Monroe to the child's christening, offering forgiveness for any role Monroe might have played in her husband's death. Monroe attended, tears streaming down her face, holding the son of the man whose death she felt responsible for. But even in death, the secrets continued. Judy Lewis, Gable's unacknowledged daughter, had spent decades being told she was adopted, growing up with those telltale Clark Gable ears that everyone noticed but no one explained. When she finally learned the truth at age 31, Gable had already been dead for years. She never got to confront him, never got to hear his side of the story, never got the acknowledgement she deserved. In 1994, more than 30 years after learning she was Clark Gable's daughter, Judy Lewis published a book titled Uncommon Knowledge, detailing the secret, the lies, and the psychological damage of growing up as Hollywood's most famous hidden child. The revelations in her book forced a re-evaluation of both Clark Gable and Loretta Young. Young, who had built a career on being Hollywood's good Catholic girl, was revealed as someone who had hidden her own daughter's identity for decades. When confronted late in her life about whether Gable had raped her, Young struggled with how to answer. She had spent so long constructing a narrative that protected everyone's reputation that facing the truth was almost impossible. She eventually acknowledged what happened, but only after decades of denial. So what do we make of Clark Gable now, 3 decades after the truth emerged? He was unquestionably talented, charismatic, and culturally significant. His performances, especially as Rhett Butler, remain iconic. He represented a particular vision of American masculinity that resonated deeply with Depression-era audiences who needed to believe in strength and confidence. But he was also a manufactured product, a creation of studio machinery that transformed an insecure factory worker with bad teeth into the king of Hollywood. He used women who cared for him as stepping stones to success. He cheated on every wife he ever had. He allegedly committed rape and, whether through choice or studio coercion, never acknowledged his daughter. He may have been involved in a drunk-driving hit-and-run that killed someone, with the studio covering up his crime. Yet none of these secrets destroyed him during his lifetime. MGM's publicity machine was so efficient, so ruthlessly effective, that Gable's image remained largely untarnished until after his death. The studio controlled the press through a combination of exclusive access and financial incentives. Gossip columnists like Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper depended on studios for information, so they played ball, hinting at scandals but never fully exposing them. There was no TMZ, no social media, no citizen journalists with camera phones. If a studio didn't want something reported, it simply wasn't reported. Compare Gable's experience to modern celebrities. Today, every mistake is captured, shared, and dissected within minutes. Private conversations are leaked, decades-old tweets resurface, and public opinion can turn on a dime. Gable lived in an era where he could father a child out of wedlock, hide that child in an orphanage, and have the mother pretend to adopt her own daughter, all without the story breaking until decades after his death. He could allegedly kill someone in a drunk driving accident and have the studio frame someone else for the crime. He could rape a co-star and continue working with her, with neither of their careers suffering any consequences. This is the dark side of Hollywood's golden age that nostalgia often overlooks. Yes, the movies were glamorous, the stars were beautiful, and the studios produced incredible art. But that system also enabled abuse, covered up crimes, and prioritized image over truth and justice over accountability. Clark Gable's double life was only possible because of a studio system that treated stars as valuable property to be protected at all costs. What's perhaps most striking about Gable's story is how long the truth stayed hidden. Judy Lewis wasn't born until 1935. She didn't learn Gable was her father until 1966. She didn't publish her book until 1994. That's nearly 60 years of secrecy, maintained through multiple generations, guarded by studios, publicists, family members, and the stars themselves. Even after Gable's death in 1960, Loretta Young continued to deny the truth for decades. The cover-up outlived the crime by half a century. And Gable's story isn't unique. During Hollywood's golden age, studios covered up everything from drug addiction to homosexuality to domestic violence to murder. They employed fixers whose entire job was making problems disappear. They had doctors on retainer who would perform abortions, treat venereal diseases, and write prescriptions for whatever stars needed, all without any records that could surface later. They had connections with police departments and district attorneys who would look the other way when stars got into trouble. They had journalists on the payroll who would kill stories or spin them in favorable directions. The entire system was designed to maintain the illusion that movie stars were special beings, more glamorous, more virtuous, and more worthy of adoration than regular people. But behind that illusion were human beings dealing with trauma, addiction, mental illness, and moral failures, just like everyone else. The difference was that they had an entire industry dedicated to hiding their humanity. As we look back on Clark Gable's life now, more than 6 decades after his death, we can finally see the complete picture. He was a man of his time, shaped by poverty, loss, and ambition. He was transformed by women who saw potential in him and by a studio system that perfected him into an idealized masculine icon. He achieved incredible success and genuine talent alongside moral failures and alleged crimes. He experienced true love and devastating loss. He was, ultimately, deeply human, with all the complexity and contradiction that implies. But for 30 years, nobody knew the whole story. They saw the king of Hollywood, the charming scoundrel, the leading man who made women's hearts race. They didn't see the man who used and discarded women, who allegedly raped a co-star and abandoned his daughter, who may have killed someone while driving drunk. That man was hidden behind studio publicity, strategic marriages, and a carefully crafted image that lasted long after the real person had died. The double life of Clark Gable reminds us that image and reality are often vastly different, especially in Hollywood. It reminds us that powerful institutions can keep secrets for generations when it serves their interests. And it reminds us that the stars we worship are human beings with flaws, failures, and secrets, no matter how brightly they shine on screen. Clark Gable lived a double life for 30 years, and by the time the truth finally emerged, he'd been gone long enough that it couldn't hurt him anymore. But the people he hurt, especially Judy Lewis, spent lifetimes dealing with the consequences of his secrets. That's the real legacy of Clark Gable, not just the iconic performances and the masculine swagger, but also the reminder that Hollywood's golden age had a very dark side, and that some secrets, no matter how well hidden, eventually come to light.